Welcome to Counselor, Beyond Conventional Defense.
Hello and welcome to Counselor, Beyond Conventional Defense, the podcast that challenges the traditional approach to criminal defense and takes a deeper look at how the justice system can evolve with attorney William Pernik, a trailblazer in criminal defense whose approach is anything but conventional. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today's episode is Mental Health and Gun Charges, a defense strategy like no other. William, welcome back.
Thank you, Kevin. It's good to be here.
Yeah, definitely. So, interesting topic. Why is the intersection of firearms and mental health such a challenging topic in criminal defense?
I think anytime you have a client who suffers from a mental health condition or substance abuse condition, who is also charged with a firearm offense, one of the things you have to confront is fear. Fear and misunderstanding that permeates the courtroom, and as a result, it leads to unjust outcomes. This is understandable on some level because people are afraid of guns. Guns are a controversial subject. It's a controversial topic in our society. The country is divided on the Second Amendment issues, on the topic of to what extent should guns be regulated. And so when you deal with a divisive topic like guns, and you add to that something that scares people, which is mental illness or extreme examples of substance abuse disorders such as methamphetamine or cocaine or alcohol-induced psychosis, you have people who are afraid. And people who are afraid respond emotionally, they respond out of fear, and that could really hurt people who need to be understood. And so what I believe in is I think the best way to approach a case involving a mentally ill client who is charged with a firearm offense is not from the perspective of fear, but from the perspective of understanding. I developed a model that we have been discussing on the show, the counselor model, the approach of going beyond conventional criminal defense by understanding the reasons why people commit these types of crimes. In this case, specifically what role mental health issues or substance abuse conditions could play in these types of charges, how we can address these underlying problems that cause the person to be involved in our criminal justice system, and how we can make sure that the person is healed so that they no longer present the danger to themselves or to others.
So can you unpack that a little bit more, how your counselor model differs from the conventional defense strategies, specifically in cases involving firearms and mental health?
Typically, in a criminal case, one would focus on issues of law and issues of fact. So from a conventional standpoint, when you have a client who is charged with a firearm-related offense, whether it be some sort of unlawful possession of a firearm because the person, for example, has a prior conviction or prior juvenile adjudication that is either a felony or involved domestic violence or involved some sort of other offense that made the person ineligible to own and possess firearm or ammunition. So that's one example of how a person could be charged with a gun-related crime. A person could be lawfully possessing the gun, but transporting it in an unlawful manner or unsafe manner. For example, carrying it in a concealed fashion without a permit, carrying it while loaded. A person could be using the gun in a confrontation. So a person could be committing a crime that involves the use of a firearm directly. All of those things are gun charges that we confront as criminal defense attorneys on a daily basis. And typically, when you have a client who is charged with a firearm-related offense, the first question that conventionally an attorney would ask would be, is there some legal strategy that could be applied in my client's case that could result in some or all of the evidence being excluded? Was the gun, for example, found as a result of an unlawful detention? Was the firearm located as a result of an illegal search? Was there a confession to possessing or using a firearm obtained in violations of persons' Miranda rights? If any of those issues are present, an attorney can file a motion, get evidence excluded, and if you exclude enough evidence, perhaps the government's case dies off on its own because there is insufficient evidence for them to proceed forward and convict your client. So that's one conventional challenge based on the law and typically criminal procedure. Separately from that, you could have factual challenges and factual defenses. For example, a gun is found in a car, multiple individuals were present in the car. Is this truly a case where your client had knowledge that the firearm was there? Or could you perhaps argue that the client was merely a passenger in the car or let somebody else borrow the car earlier? Can you argue that your client did not knowingly possess this firearm? Do you have some other defenses, factual defenses that could apply? Could you conduct a significant private investigation, for example, and uncover some additional facts that challenge the government's theory of the case? Those would be factual approaches, and conventionally an attorney would use a private investigator or in a public defender setting. They would have a an in-house investigator who would go and interview prospective witnesses, trying to either develop new facts or challenge existing facts, or perhaps present an alternative interpretation of the facts that the government has. Those approaches are conventional. What we do differently is we go beyond the legal challenges and the factual challenges, and we try to understand the reasons why a person might be in unlawful possession of a firearm, why a person might be unlawfully using the firearm. Is there some underlying issue that's causing the behavior in the first place, so that even in a case where legal challenges fail, even in a case where factual challenges fail, we can still help our client. And oftentimes we can help him in a much more significant way by not only addressing the current problem that led to them contacting us in the first place, being arrested in the first place, being charged with the crime to begin with, but also fix the problem that caused this behavior so that it does not reoccur, so it protects the person and it protects the society in large, because after all, we are talking about guns, and specifically in this episode, underlying mental health or substance use issues.
Do you have an example of how the counselor model was applied in a real case in this situation?
Sure, I can give you many examples, but one example that immediately comes to mind that really illustrates this point well is the case of a client who I'm going to refer to as Jerry. That's not his real name, but we're going to use it to protect his confidentiality. And so in this particular example, Jerry had a prior conviction that made it unlawful for him to possess firearms. Jerry was an alcoholic and Jerry was severely depressed. We're going to talk about some of these conditions later in this episode, but because of the profound depression that Jerry fell into, he decided to do something really horrible, which is to commit suicide. He obtained a firearm, which he was not allowed to have, and he tried to kill himself, but was not successful. He came into contact with law enforcement later. As a result of lawful interaction with Jerry, police were able to connect the firearm to him, and because he's not allowed to possess it, he knowingly possessed the gun. He really did not have either a legal challenge or a factual challenge to the crime. So you have this really unusual case where a person is extremely sympathetic, obviously suffers from profound depression, obviously suffers from alcoholism, and yet is clearly guilty of a crime. So the only path forward is through a conviction. My approach was very different. My approach was to study the reasons why Jerry was found to be in the possession of a firearm, why we have a person who's not allowed to possess a gun possessing a gun. And once we had covered the true reason why he was unlawfully possessing the gun, once we uncovered the incredible depth of depression that he fell into, the profound amount of alcohol abuse, once he connected with appropriate treatment resources under our guidance, once we were able to retain a forensic expert who presented all of these facts in a really well-organized, well-documented, and persuasive manner, not only were we able to not have Jerry, in this case, go to prison, which is where he would otherwise have gone, but we were able to put him on a path to get his entire case dismissed. And the district attorney agreed with it because they too saw that true justice in this case was to have an individual who is sick get help. It's not something that would happen through conventional approach. There was no motion we could have filed. In Jerry's specific case, you have an example where a person is factually guilty of the crime, in this case, unlawful possession of a firearm by a person prohibited to possess it, a person in whose case evidence was legally obtained, and yet the outcome that the law provided for was not an appropriate outcome from an equitable perspective. It just wasn't just to have a person who bought a gun illegally to kill himself get convicted. You're re-traumatizing a person who's already traumatized.
Right.
And so instead, we were able to put this person on a path to treatment and rehabilitation. And I think we're able to open a door to a completely different chapter in his life. And this individual is now thriving and will get his case dismissed. So I think this is a really good example of where my model succeeds, whereas conventional approaches just don't go far enough and could fail.
You mentioned that you wanted to talk about some of the specific disorders or substance abuse issues. Can you describe how your counselor model handles cases involving these types of mental illnesses?
Sure. I think it's important to begin the process by having a comprehensive interview with your client. It's important to investigate your client's background. It's important to interview your client's family members and to understand what is it that your client may actually be suffering from. We rely on these initial interviews and initial observations by our trained staff in order to give us at least an initial clue as to what kind of expert we might want to retain. We have a network of experts that we work with, and depending on the condition that attorney believes the client is suffering from, a particular type of expert might be better suited than others. Commonly, I see clients in this specific realm of firearm offenses who suffer from depression, who suffer from anxiety. I have a lot of clients who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. My first experience with clients who suffered post-traumatic stress disorder was actually many years ago when I started working very, very closely with our military clients and veteran clients as a population of clients. And so we have a lot of young men and women who, for the last 20 years plus, have been sent to places like the Middle East. They have been deployed in combat or sometimes sustained trauma and had been exposed to trauma, maybe in non-combat roles. And so a lot of these folks came back home, but invisible scars from what they have witnessed have come home with them. And so I was first exposed to post-traumatic stress disorder and its symptomology when I started working with veteran population of clients. I also saw a lot of that in survivors of sexual assault and survivors of domestic violence. And so with firearm cases, I see quite a few clients who get arrested for these types of offenses when they exhibit symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, such as, for example, impulsivity, overreaction to perceived threats, hypervigilance, very, very common. We see quite a few clients who suffer from psychosis and various types of psychotic disorders. On the organic side, you could have, for example, a person who is schizophrenic, or we could have people who suffer from drug-induced psychosis. For example, somebody who abuses on a regular basis methamphetamine or cocaine or other forms of drugs that could trigger over a period of time a person to become psychotic. And in many ways, they will act just like a schizophrenic person would. And so each of these types of conditions, and there are many, many other examples, but these are just the most common ones I see. But each one of these will present its unique set of symptoms and unique explanations for why your client may have acted a certain way. And if you understand how this condition affects person's behavior, affects their judgment, affects their thinking, then you begin to open doors to resolving the case in a really appropriate manner for that particular client, getting them the help that they need while keeping them and everybody else safe. And I think that's something we all agree is the preferred way of doing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. To your point on the case with Jerry, like just throwing a guy like that in jail, what good does that do anybody? You
No,
know?
he's suicidal.
Yeah.
He's obviously clinically depressed. You're
Yeah.
going to make him more depressed. What you're going to do is you're going to create a scenario where this poor person, having received no help, is even more likely to do something. He's just going to do it in a different setting. Now,
Right.
instead of committing suicide with a firearm, he's going to potentially do something to himself while in custody. And then
Yep.
the jail gets sued, the county gets sued. What good did that accomplish? As
Yeah.
opposed to, let's look and see what happened to this person. Let's marshal the right resources. Let's help him. And he is amazing. He is now telling other people how to get help. He has become a leader in some ways in his community. And I'm really proud of the work that he's done. And I've had really interesting personal conversations with him. And he's just a person who represents many, many other people I've encountered along the way. So depression, it's a really good example because it definitely can cause a person to have impaired judgment. In this case, we used a very obvious scenario where somebody was super depressed, became suicidal, purchased a firearm, but that's not the only type of criminal behavior involving a gun that you could see with a person who suffers from depression. Depression could result in a person having significantly impaired judgment. A person could engage in risky behaviors. A person could acquire a gun or use a gun impulsively. They could carry or use the gun in a setting where it's not appropriate. And so it's really crucial to approach situations involving clinically depressed clients with empathy and understanding, and by recognizing the need for mental health and treatment and support, as opposed to focusing solely on punitive measures. And fortunately, we have tools in California now that can really help people who suffer from depression. It's just a matter of educating professionals engaging and educating clients, and lawyers advocating for their clients appropriately, which is the message I'm trying to create and spread, and hopefully one that takes off. I want to
Hmm.
give you another example for instance, with anxiety. We have quite a few clients who suffer from anxiety. This could be a person who experienced some sort of traumatic incident in the past, perhaps a person who had been exposed to trauma but does not fully meet the clinical definition of post-traumatic stress disorder. But you could definitely have a person who overreacts to perceived threat because they're so highly anxious. You could have a person who finds it extremely difficult to control their worries. These are folks who often feel really keyed up or on edge. They feel really restless. They may have difficulty concentrating. They're very irritable at times. They often don't sleep because they worry so much. In order for you to actually meet clinical definition of this disorder, you have to have symptoms that I just described that cause you really significant distress. They have to impair you either in social functioning, your professional functioning, or other important areas, and it could really lead to impaired decision making, and in particular heightened fear responses. And that's where we see cases where somebody may brandish a firearm in response to a perceived threat, maybe not reacting, but overreacting to something they saw. And do we really want to punish a person who is doing this out of their anxiety as opposed to true desire to harm another individual or some deep-seated criminality? Because I think we have to differentiate between people who are here, who belong in a criminal courtroom because they want to hurt other people, and people who are here because there is some underlying condition that caused it to happen or made it easier for it to come about. And I think that's what we try to do when we look at underlying reasons behind why a person may have committed the crime. And we learn that somebody has been prescribed medication, somebody has been seeing a doctor, somebody maybe has stopped taking their medication, or maybe had another life stressor or a trigger that caused them to spin out. But if you understand how these conditions affect a person's thinking, affect their behavior, affect their judgment, you begin to understand differently. And I think you begin to understand better why they may have carried a gun, why they may have reached for a gun, why they may have used a firearm. And nobody is saying that you're going to get a walk on a murder because you suffer from anxiety. That's not the situation we're describing. But we can have a good person who suffers from this condition in a clinically significant way, who overreacts, and that person could be a licensed professional. This person could be your child's teacher. This person could be your neighbor. This person could be you. And you just have this underlying condition that needs to be addressed, other than by incarcerating you or criminally prosecuting you. And we have methods in California, such as mental health diversion, which is one very, very significant tool that lawyers have, and we can help a lot of people. Post-traumatic stress disorder, that's a condition that develops after exposure to a really traumatic event. I've described, for example, combat veterans who suffer from military sexual trauma or MST, survivors of sexual assault, survivors of domestic violence. Symptoms of PTSD could be really, really debilitating and really intrusive. In order to get clinically diagnosed with PTSD, you have to have these symptoms that fall into category of intrusive thoughts. Those could include nightmares. They can include flashbacks. We have spouses of veterans who report these night terrors and how their husbands wake up and sometimes they don't even realize for a moment exactly where they're located.
Right. Yeah, I've heard that.
You could have symptoms such as reminders or avoidance of places or things that remind you of trauma you suffered. It could result in really significant, negative changes in your thoughts and your mood. People can feel like super detached. They could have really negative view of themselves and the world. It affects their arousal. It affects how they react and interact with things. You could be really irritable, super hyper vigilant. I see that a lot with veteran population and survivors of abuse. Domestic abuse or sexual abuse. Difficulty with sleep is quite common. So if you think about all of these symptoms, and if you look at the definition and you realize that in order to be diagnosed with this, they have to be persistent, they have to last for a long period of time and cause significant distress, you can begin to understand, wow, this person is dealing with a lot. This isn't just a snapshot of a person's life that we're looking at, that somebody yelled at someone and pulled out a gun. There are some reasons why this happened. And once you realize that what you saw on the day of the incident, what a police officer observed and documented in their report, was just the tip of the iceberg, and there is 99% of the iceberg below it, and you explain to your prosecutor, to your judge, to the probation officer all of the reasons why a person acted a certain way, you're going to obtain a vastly different outcome in a criminal case, either a straight dismissal or reduction of charges. Something very, very positive is going to come if your client is willing to pursue greater knowledge and insight into their mental health condition. If they're really willing to engage in treatment, I think it's going to make people in power, like judges and prosecutors, people who have a lot of control and power and authority over clients of mine, they're going to be less afraid. They will be less afraid.
Yeah.
They will feel more certain that the right things are being followed so that the person is less dangerous. The less
Right.
afraid somebody is of my client, the better the outcome is going to be for my client.
Definitely.
Very,
Yeah,
very simple, but it works. It works virtually every time, and it needs to be done more often. And then, of course, this brings us to the last category that everybody is really worried about and really scared of. And that's when you deal with thought disorders. When you have a schizophrenic individual, when you have a person in a state of psychosis, that can get really, really scary, because at this point, we're dealing with the most extreme group of symptoms. You're now dealing with folks who are delusional. So they view the world in a very different way. A reality of a person who suffers from delusions, whether those are delusions of grandeur or some other fixed but false beliefs. And I've been exposed to really fascinating stories that really would be hard for an average person to comprehend. I've been exposed to clients who suffered from delusions that had to do with vampiric rituals, with Aboriginal customs, with really fantastical stuff, saving souls, punishing sinners, delusions of being a messiah. You really could put no end to how far this could go, because
Sure.
we're all endowed with incredible brains, and when things go haywire in our brain, there's virtually no limit as to how far this could go. I always imagine, a disorder like schizophrenia or a different type of psychotic disorder. It's almost like there is a filter that sees and hears and perceives the same reality as I do and that you do. But when it's broken, it could really lead to fascinating and horrifying outcomes. When we deal with people who are psychotic, whether it's because they have consumed some drugs that may have caused them to become psychotic, or because they suffer from an organic condition such as schizophrenia, for example, another type of psychotic disorder, you're dealing with people whose reality is very different from ours, but who genuinely believe in what they see. These are folks who are not responding to actual threats. They're responding to perceived threats. They feel very real to them, just like you being a radio host feels really real to you, or me being a lawyer feels real to me. More significantly, these folks are really paranoid. They believe that other people are after them. And because they're constantly in this fight or flight mode, they can go to extreme lengths to protect themselves. And oftentimes that includes buying a gun, because they think that people are going to come after them. Government agents are going to come after them. Aliens are going to come after them. Terrorists are going to come after them, whatever the specific delusion may be. And so what we can do when we work with a mentally ill client who suffers from a state of psychosis is we can help them get stabilized. We can make sure that they receive help by taking antipsychotic medication. We can make sure that this person, if they're not legally competent because of the mental health condition, that they regain competency oftentimes while they're in custody. We can put them on a path of treatment. And then once a person gets treated and they understand how bizarre and how crazy their thoughts were, oftentimes my clients are shocked by their own conduct once they learn about it with a clear, sober mind. And so instead of looking at a person who did a series of really scary and really crazy events, we can now look at it as a person who suffers from a mental health condition, whether it's drug-induced or organic, and obtaining help for that. And once we get them the help that they need, we can make sure that they no longer present danger to themselves or to others, and we can obtain far greater outcomes for them, oftentimes including a dismissal of their criminal case, reduction of charges, or other types of dispositions that you just would not be able to obtain otherwise if this is a case where evidence is obtained lawfully and you don't have factual challenges. So the advantage of applying the counselor model is that by looking at the underlying reasons why somebody might engage in a series of these really scary acts that could be really dangerous to others, by understanding why it happened and treating the underlying reasons, we can not only make the person better, but also make it safer for everyone else, and obviously obtain far better legal outcomes for clients, because their judges and their prosecutors will now be far less afraid of them, knowing that there is treatment, knowing that there is some safety measures in place, and obviously education and developing insight into one's own medical conditions and mental illness is really, really important, paramount important.
Absolutely. All right. Well, interesting stuff. Thanks for tuning in to Counselor Beyond Conventional Defense with attorney William Pernik. To connect with William and his team, head to perniklaw.com, and don't forget to like our video and subscribe. We got lots of great content coming your way. William, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate all the insight.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.